Hey, it's Hethel with the Global Health Pursuit podcast. Today, we're diving into a topic that's becoming more and more urgent by the day: climate change. More specifically, how small businesses can play a huge role in combating it. You've probably heard about forest fires and heat waves, but how do they connect to the larger picture of climate change? And here's another angle. How does climate change pose a national security threat? We're also going to talk about practical solutions. What can businesses do to reduce their carbon footprints? And how can they start taking action right now? Our guest today is Mike Smith, the co-founder and CEO of Acclimate, a company that's leading the charge in helping small to medium-sized businesses achieve carbon neutrality. Mike's journey is pretty fascinating. He went from a career in the Navy to starting a company that's all about sustainability. In this episode, we cover a lot of ground. Mike shares his personal experiences that led him down this path, how reforestation and carbon markets fit into the fight against climate change, and even a concept called fatal heat. He also talks about how climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's a threat to national security. And of course, we get into decarbonization and how businesses, even the little guys, can make a real difference. My name is Hethel Bauman, and this is the Global Health Pursuit podcast, where we explore inspiring stories from leaders dedicated to making the world a better place. Make sure you're subscribed, leave a 5-star review, and share this episode with someone who's also passionate about sustainability. Your support helps the podcast grow and keeps the conversation going. Let's get into it. When your team reached out to me to have you on, I was like, this is something that I haven't really touched on in the podcast. And I think it's because I wasn't sure which angle to take it. And also, I myself don't really have too much of a background in climate. I think that, there's so many things happening in the world right now. And with climate, it's hard to see what's happening as like a regular, just everyday person. You'll see people be like, oh, well, it's like really hot today, or it's snowing more than usual. And until things like forest fires happen a lot more often, and this term fatal heat that we'll talk about later on in the episode, until those things start happening, we're not able to actually wrap our brains around it. And so that's kind of why I'm very excited about this topic, because I'm probably going to ask you a lot of beginner-based questions. But before we dive into that, I know that you've had an extensive background or a long career in the Navy. Can you tell us about that journey from working in the Navy, being part of that for so many years, and then moving into the entrepreneurial space, but specifically within climate?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. It's obviously a topic I enjoy talking about, and being married to somebody in the medical space who loves talking about public health, I think this is a fun intersection. Yeah, my personal background, I grew up in Idaho. My grandfather was a forester, and his wife, my grandmother, had a weak heart. He used to take her on a lot of hikes. When I was a kid, we'd go with him, and you'd learn about the forest walking next to the knee of your grandfather. And in 1989, there was a fire called the Loman Fire, and it put up a mushroom cloud. I've come to find out later it's called a pyrocumulonimbus cloud.
What's a mushroom cloud?
Yeah, so as a child of the Cold War myself, a mushroom cloud is when there's an incredibly high heat event, and it blows the column of heat pushes into the next layer of the atmosphere, the stratosphere. And so then it starts to cool out. And so what you have is kind of like this column of in the Cold War, it was of a nuclear weapon, the fallout coming up in this column. So that was very weird to me in 1989 because it was still prior to the end of the Soviet Union. And I looked at that and I thought, man, that is one weird looking thing. And I didn't realize at the time that it was a fire that was burning so hot that it was literally changing the weather.
Wow.
And my grandfather, the forester, was like, he was actually pretty advanced for his time. And he said, fires are part of the natural cycle of things when it comes to forests. It'll grow back. And I said, okay. But what he didn't know is that there was something new and that the scale and intensity of forest fires had changed. And it was kind of actually, there's a lot of complex things that go into there, but one of the big ones was climate. So anyways, I was 9 years old. I didn't know any different. Great. I went to the Naval Academy just because it seemed like an adventuresome, life less ordinary for a young man in my case. And while I was at the Naval Academy, I studied systems engineering and political science, but low key, I actually kind of got the Naval Academy to give me an environmental degree. On the systems engineering side, I studied environmental engineering. And then on the political science, whenever I wrote a paper, if I had an option, I wrote it about how environmental policy interacts with politics. So, for example, I wrote a national security papers. Some of my national security papers were about environmental stressors. My honors thesis was actually about something called the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990, which were the precursors to the modern carbon markets. So the Navy trains you up in how to think, and then they tell you not to use that and go off and do things. And so I became a pilot. I was an F-18 pilot for about 12 and a half years active duty. In 2011, life was great. I had just gotten married. I was the demo pilot, so I was doing air shows all over. I was the halftime show for a jet boat race in Detroit. I did the Chicago,
cool.
Super fun. It's just like a license to steal when it comes to flying.
Right.
I was performing in front of hundreds of thousands of people at the Chicago Air and Water Show in 2011, flying right down the lakefront. Like, it was awesome.
Whoa.
Super fun. But it's about as fun as it gets. And then I brought my wife back to Idaho to kind of show her where I'd grown up. And we went by the Lowman fire and it wasn't coming back. And this was 22 years later. And that just sparked in me something. I'd been starting to have doubts about the Navy because I knew the fun quotient was going down. It was going to be less fun moving forward, and the pain quotient was going to go up. I was married. I would have to spend time away from my wife. I knew I wanted to have children. I'd have to spend time away from them. And so I got to thinking about what would be my next act. And based upon my background with what I'd studied at the academy, I was like, I can do this. It's the naivety of being an entrepreneur, maybe. This is thinking that it might be easier than it really is. But yeah, that's what I did. I got out of the service about as early as I could, 2014. And I started a company called Renew West about planting areas of burned by wildfire in the American West with native grown trees and leveraging carbon markets in order to finance it. And so that's how I kind of got into the space.
So what made you want to start your own company?
Yeah. So one is I looked around at the people that were working on reforestation, and there was a lot of good nonprofits. And so I didn't think there was much I could add there. Two was I didn't think that there were enough people chasing the reforestation angle on the carbon market side of things. And that, matter of fact, there really wasn't anybody at the time.
When you say the carbon market, what do you mean by that?
Sure. So there are individuals and mostly companies, about 98% of the markets from that have to either voluntarily or by law pay somebody to clean up their pollution. So that's known as a carbon offset. There's a lot of different ways that I think the purest and scientifically the most available from actually being able to reduce atmospheric carbon concentrations from a nature-based solution is reforestation, both on a domestic and a global scale. So I saw this as a huge opportunity that needed to be addressed. I saw it as a way to kind of grow the pie, not to compete with the nonprofits, but to actually expand their capacity to do the work. The nonprofit model wasn't going to scale to the size of the problem.
Right.
There was not enough philanthropy in the world to plant all those trees. You were going to have to figure out a way either to bring governments or private capital into it. And so this was an attempt to bring private capital into it.
Yeah, I feel like, it's so interesting that you say that there's not enough philanthropy that can plant that many trees. It's like, how many people can donate? I know that one of your biggest things that you talk about is national security. And I was reading through some of the blogs on your website, Acclimate. And one of the blogs that you wrote in April of 2023, you reference Sean Hughes' 2020 blog, and it states that the global pandemic was the greatest infringement upon our collective liberty, and it came from a non-traditional threat. So that non-traditional threat was coronavirus. And it was made far worse by our inability to respond due to insufficient infrastructure. Non-traditional threats, especially climate, are what national security is really about in the 21st century. And I guess there's two parts to this question. First, can you explain what a traditional threat might be? And then why is climate a non-traditional threat?
I entered the Naval Academy in 1998 and I graduated in 2002. And so when I entered in 98, the thinking of the world was around state-on-state action, that it was within a national security construct, which is that the U.S. military needed to prepare for potential conflict with other countries, and that there would be uniformed militaries doing things, and there might be some espionage or whatever, but it was primarily a country v. country. And what we learned, a really hard lesson on September 11th of 2001, was that there were non-state actors. And this wasn't considered a traditional threat at the time. This was a non-traditional threat.
What do you mean by a non-state actor?
So a non-state actor in national security is like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization. They're not hosted or sponsored. They may have some sponsorship things going with that. You see that, for example, with Hezbollah and Iran. Like they may have some state sponsorship, but they're also an independent actor. In the case of Al-Qaeda, they had grown powerful enough that they were actually starting to drive the behaviors of states. Afghanistan in that example, Sudan. And so we had to learn the hard lesson that is that the security landscape is a lot more complex than just like a few, countries that you have to pay attention to. There are other threats that you have to pay attention to from a national security perspective. And the argument that I've been making here, and I was making in that blog post, was that we actually have to expand that map even further. And they're from non-human components. Within national security constructs, they tend to think about force multipliers or threat multipliers, which is kind of a fancy term of a soldier in an airplane is far more effective than a soldier on the ground, right? If they have the right equipment and training, then, they're worth like 100 soldiers on the ground. And that's the idea of a force multiplier, but there's also threat multipliers. And sometimes people think of like within national security of climate as being a threat multiplier, which is that it makes the components of the enemy a lot stronger. And I think that's the wrong framework. I actually think that that climate change is not a threat multiplier. It is the threat itself. And that what it is the root cause, the root problem of what will be a cascading series of events that there is no degree of adaptation that we can prepare for. If you really wanted to tackle climate change as a threat, you're going to have to use things that, from a national security perspective, military people aren't always super comfortable with. Like they're not used to dealing with this because it's not about bombs and guns. It's really more about statecraft. And it's not even just about statecraft. It's really about international aid. There's a huge public health component to it. There's engaging all the levers of soft power in the American construct.
What do you mean by soft power?
Yeah, sure. So one of the ways that the United States became a superpower was not just through its military. We have the world's strongest military, right? But also that we had Hollywood driving global culture in a lot of ways. The United Nations is in New York. The World Health Organization, all these organizations were created in the American construct. And they're big power levers of soft power. The American economy is a huge lever of soft power in the fact that we can, just through buying power alone, really change the behaviors of other countries.
Right.
And generally for the better, but not always, but generally for the better. And so thinking about those levers of soft power outside of the military, which is more of a hard power, like tanks and guns.
Right. And so in the sense of national security, you also mention that climate is a driver of mass suffering. And so I was just trying to wrap my head around it because you were saying that it's almost the beginning of a domino effect. How does this affect national security? And really, how is this a driver of mass suffering?
Sure. I'll start with the more subtle and then move to the more extreme as I go through the examples. All of human civilization has been built during a time period known as the Holocene, roughly the last 11,000 years of a pretty stable climate. The temperature hasn't fluctuated a great deal. Humans have been on the planet for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, but human civilization has only been around for about 10,000 years.
Right.
An important component of that is that the dawn of civilization was associated with agriculture, right? And so agriculture is highly dependent upon climate. And so when you start changing the systems of climate, you start changing the systems of agriculture. And so you start seeing, wheat shortages. A big component of the Arab Spring was associated with a wheat shortage, right? And so nobody really talks about it, but like that was an environmental driver of the Arab Spring. And it's not the only, but it was one that like critically destabilized it. Prices of wheat had gone up. People were hungry. They were frustrated with the cost. It caused political instability, in some not insignificant part, like the atrocities that have happened in Syria have been a result of that. But like what caused the Arab Spring to get that going was an environmentally driven issue. And so as the world is rapidly warming, we're seeing great stress on agricultural systems around the planet. In effect, we have built a world that's not adapted to the world we're creating. And so agriculture in the Western United States is dependent upon snowpack in the Colorado Rockies. That's failing. We're going to start to see a lot of that changing. And when that starts changing, you're going to start seeing mass migration. One of the things that's not appreciated is there are more internally displaced people on the planet, or there are more refugees on the planet right now than in any time in human history, including World War II. Wow. Now, as a percentage of the human population, it's less, but as in terms of human beings, it's much larger. And the reason we don't get a lot of attention around that is because they're mostly internally displaced. They've moved from one place in a country to another place in a country. But as there are limits to internal displacement, when a country becomes so destabilized that it can no longer deal with its own problems internally, then they become externally displaced. They become refugees. The more extreme example, and this is what you and I talked about before, is, we're starting to not just make places less livable, we're making places unlivable. So, for example, there's a concept known as fatal heat, and you alluded to it at the beginning. There are combinations of temperatures and dew points where human beings will not survive outside. In effect, it's where there's enough moisture in the air and the heat's high enough that if you perspire, it will not evaporate except for above your internal body temperature. And so if the water doesn't evaporate except for at 99 or 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that means that when it evaporates, it's not cooling you off.
Perspiration is supposed to be your body's technique to cool you off, right? So
exactly. And so it doesn't matter how healthy you are, it doesn't matter how much water you're drinking, it doesn't matter how much shade you have in those conditions. You will die given enough time and at high enough temperatures. And so there was a paper that was written a couple of years back about this happening in the subcontinent, area of Asia. So India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. 1.75 billion people live there. That's not known for being a cold area by any stretch. Right. It's already kind of a warm climate. And so something like 15% of that population already lives in an extreme heat scenario. And this is one of those where like unhealthy people without enough water can already hurt themselves. But that's going to cover 75% of that population in some of the more extreme climate scenarios. So moving to over 1 billion people, that's going to put some like real stresses on what people do.
Is there like an extrapolation in terms of like, if we don't do anything right now, like when do we predict that like mass migration start happening?
In some ways, it's already starting. It's hard to know, right? Because we don't know what the future portends as far as like how on top of emissions we get. Right now, if every country in the world were to get on top of its climate emissions, we're looking for about, is for what they've claimed that they're going to do, that's going to be about 3 degrees of warming. The UN says that we're in real trouble after 2 degrees. The higher scenarios of like 4 or 5 degrees, that's when you start talking about over 1 billion people in the 3-state subcontinental area. It's hard to know, but I would expect you to start increasingly see these effects now, probably getting in real earnest in the 2030s. So this is the most critical decade The other thing I was going to talk about there, though, is the concept of fatal heat, which is where you have extreme temperatures. In the higher emission scenarios, that goes to as much as 4% of the population. So we're talking like 70 million people living in an area where if they lost air conditioning, they would die. That's a huge number. And there's just no way that that number of people live there after that. You have whole components about economic and social and environmental justice. It starts getting real messy real fast. You also start adding in that India and Pakistan are both nuclear states. They border a third nuclear state, which is China, who's having its own problems. Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. The Ganges Delta there in Bangladesh is the most likely to flood river delta in the world based upon climate change as well. So you start seeing these cascading effects that kind of grow beyond the ability for adaptation. There is no degree of border walls or tanks and guns where you're going to be able to keep that number of people. Like, you're just talking like catastrophic human suffering.
When you say nuclear state, what does that mean?
As in they have a nuclear weapon.
Got it. Okay.
So in high stress scenarios, you start dialing up the potential for nuclear war. The threat multiplier is the fact that they're a nuclear state. In my opinion, the threat is this climate. This is going to be the root cause of what causes these problems. To give you more context, here in the United States, we had some temperatures like that this year, fatal heat numbers. We had a dew point in Lawrence, Kansas last summer that got to a heat index that got to 134 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, thankfully, it did persist for too long, but it's not just over there for the American audience. It's also here. The interior Midwest around the Mississippi River Valley is actually supposed to be one of the areas that's most affected by this as well. And we're already starting to see examples of that.
These things happening, even especially like in the US, right? Because I think many people who live in the US are like, oh, well, these things are just happening out in countries like India and Bangladesh. Well, we don't really have to worry about that. But when it starts happening here, I guess my next question is really like, how are governments reacting to climate change right now? And I think you talk a lot about this, but like what's really missing in the strategy?
So the Paris Accords at COP21 were what kind of set the global political targets. And that's been fairly catalytic. It was something that science had always kind of known, that there were some tipping points that started to happen about 1.5 C and another set at 2 C, and we could talk about that. So that has driven some of these national commitments, and that's been good. A lot of that, though, there's really two things that governments are responsive to. One is political pressure from the populace, and two is from economic pressure from the elites. The economic pressure from the elites, people are starting to realize that this is a huge threat to business, right? Like, if you want to continue to make money, you need to have a stable political climate. You need to have, stable environment. You need to have a lot. And so you're starting to see some big action there. What came out of COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 was a commitment of 40% of the world's wealth under management, the largest number ever uttered in the history of markets. I think it was $130 trillion. Just a number that boggles the mind, all being committed to a net zero future. There's been a little bit of backsliding in that, but by and large, it's standing. And so as wealth managers and huge institutional funds, this is like the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, for example, as they continue to steer more and more towards net zero, you're going to see more and more business activity that's kind of going that direction. And you're going to feel, as more business activity goes that way, there's going to be pressure on governments to coordinate the regulation associated with that.
When you say net zero, you mean net zero emissions?
Yeah. So the Paris goal not only set a target for total warming, but it also set a pathway. And so that pathway is that as human society globally, we have to cut roughly half of our emissions relative to the 2020 baseline by 2030. We need to cut half of the remainder again by 2040 and half of the remainder of that by 2050. That comes down to roughly about 90% emissions reductions by 2050. And the net part of it is that we also need to scale up the ability of nature and technology to absorb carbon from the atmosphere, which is how you get to the zero. So that last 10% you're actively capturing from the atmosphere.
We're talking about mitigation of climate change, and then the term decarbonization is often used by the companies and businesses. And I wanted to ask you, like, really just almost like dumb it down. What does this mean? How is it being used in like new businesses that are being developed that target climate change?
Sure. So decarbonization is the act of reducing your business's or individual footprint when it comes to climate. There tends to be a little bit of a categorization where people tend to think, well, it's all big business that needs to take care of this. If we just yelled at oil companies enough, they'll stop. That doesn't really work. The flip side is the oil companies tend to be like, well, if individuals would just stop buying this, that would make it work too, right? But that also doesn't really work. Like, how do you live in a system that requires energy, but like if that energy is dirty?
Right.
And so the reality of it is it's both. It's a shared responsibility that we need to both be examining our own personal footprint and our companies that we work for. This is actually, as an individual, one of the biggest levers of power you have is to go to your employer and be like, what are you doing about decarbonization? Costs you nothing other than a little bit of time. And I guarantee you, your employer is going to care about it. How a business does it is they measure what their footprint is, then they figure out how to reduce it. And then, in my opinion, they need to be offsetting the remainder because that creates an internal price of carbon. That's the overarching framework. In practical terms, for individuals, the things that you can do, just eat a little bit less meat. That's a big one. You don't have to go full vegetarian or even vegan, but just go meatless Monday.
Some people think it's so hard.
Yeah, I'd like to say I'm a part-time vegetarian. Like I eat mostly vegetarian, but we had a nice roast for Christmas, for example. Mm-hmm.
So my question to you though is in relation to eating meat, like what does eating meat have to do with climate change?
Sure. So it takes 3 pounds of feed to create 1 pound of chicken meat for you to eat. It takes 17 pounds of feed to convert that into 1 pound of beef. It might even be a little bit more. So there's just like the energy conversion. Living things consume energy, right? And so the amount of just the embodied carbon associated with producing the grain to feed a chicken or a cow. That's one, but especially on the beef component. Cows are ruminants. Ruminants belch, and that's part of how they chew their cud. They swallow the grass, they chew it up, and then they chew it again, right? And then they swallow it into a separate stomach. That process produces a lot of methane. Methane is a massive greenhouse gas. It's 25 times as bad pound for pound as carbon dioxide. So just having fewer cows is better from that perspective. So meat's one. Avoiding food waste is a huge one. The folks at Project Drawdown talk about that something like 40% of the food in America goes into the garbage. And when it's in the garbage, it anaerobically digests because it's not in the presence of oxygen. And that produces methane. And methane's a bad climate pollutant. And so, not to mention all the wasted energy associated with producing that food, especially if it's meat. So just like if you are going to buy something, eat it and be very deliberate about it. We've become really accustomed to being okay with a little bit of food wastage, and traditional societies just don't do that. Those two alone will make you healthier and save you money as an individual, right? And so there's also this framework there where people tend to think like, to do the right thing on climate, I've got to spend money. No, this will save you money. Those are the two biggest things that you can do. Another one is banking, where you as an individual bank is a massive driver of climate. We all have a kind of this general understanding that, you put deposits in a bank, they use that money to lend out to somebody else. Well, big banks like Chase, for example, are lending that money out for fossil fuel development. So your money in being used by Chase, for example, is being used to fund fossil fuel development. We already have enough proven reserves on this planet to cook the planet several times over. Like, we don't need to develop any new fossil fuels. And so, where you bank is a big part of that as well. So those are just a couple, like 3 things. Cost you nothing. It's pretty easy to do. Huge footprints. And you'll probably be happy, healthier, and more prosperous if you do these things. So it's not an either or. It's better for you.
Wow. That just gives me a lot to think about.
So Chase is one of the most egregious examples, but they're certainly not alone.
You mentioned going to your employer and kind of talking to them about what they're doing in terms of decarbonization and mitigating their footprint. This is something that you do as one part of your company, Acclimate. So Can you talk about Acclimate, why you started Acclimate, and what your mission with this company is?
So Acclimate, I like the verb to acclimate, ACCLIMATE, because it has the word climate and it's to change to an evolving climate. Unfortunately, that URL wasn't available, so I had to tech bro it up. So it's ACLYMATE.
I like it.
Thank you. So my first company, Renew West, which is still doing well and great, and we planted a few million trees in California last year, and they're off doing some really cool stuff internationally too. I'm really proud of where that's going. I was an advisor to the U.S. Climate Alliance, which were the 26 states that stayed part of the Paris Accords when the Trump administration pulled us out. I was there to advise people about carbon markets and climate policy. There was a couple states that they already kind of leading the charge, California being the most obvious example. But there were a lot of people that were just kind of overwhelmed by it from other states. Part of that's because it's properly federal level policy and they kind of got dropped in the deep end of the pool. But a big part of it was, why is there a deep end of the pool? Which is why is this so hard for people that are paid to care about it, actually do care about it, and it's their job. Why are they having a hard time with this? Like, we've made this unapproachable. And so I got to thinking, climate decisions, again, tend to be like from a top-down sort of scenario. And I alluded to this earlier, but there's really a huge bottom-up component to this, which is like governments are responsive to their people. Even non-democratic states like still have to deal with the issues of the individuals or face revolt. And so like being agitated and making climate and smart decisions as an individual and as a smaller organization is really important, because that actually is how you change the behavior there. And so we looked at the marketplace and we saw that there were a lot of large corporations that were, because they were closest to these big financial institutions, that were starting to deal with their climate footprint. But there was not really a solution for the smaller companies. And U.S. small businesses are defined as having fewer than 500 employees. If they were a standalone country, they likely would be the fourth largest emitter on the planet. And nobody was really talking about them. And there's some really neat stuff that happens at the SMB level. SMB stands for small to medium-sized business. SMBs are far closer to their employees. Like an employee can reach out and talk to the boss of an SMB.
Right.
At almost and as long as you're in that definition, you probably can go talk to the boss. The founder, the CEO, the whomever you want to talk about. And so they have a much closer relationship with them. They have a much closer relationship with each other. There's some real networks associated with this. And they are the linchpin of the U.S. economy, specifically supply chains to those larger institutions. And so we saw this actually as a real big lever of change, where if we can provide them the tools to make smarter decisions for those companies that aren't acting, they can influence up, they can influence down, they are the central, most important node of the U.S. economy when it comes to climate. And so that was the theory of change associated with it. And then we also saw that it was an opportunity for a startup that was, big corporations tend to like to work with other big corporations. It takes a little bit of time, but like a startup can get in there and can work with some of these SMBs. It's a hard space, but I really like the people that we're working with.
So talk about some of the resources that you provide as a company for these small businesses.
Our vision statement is to educate and empower humanity for our best climate future. And so educate and empower is a big part of what we do. Roughly, there's 3 steps for dealing with your footprint if you're a small business, which is to measure, reduce, and to offset. And I talked about that before. So measuring, we provide software that connects into your existing like accounting and utility information, pulls that information out, tries to automate it as much as possible, doesn't require you to become a climate expert to start engaging with your footprint in a meaningful and powerful way. We try to do that at an affordable price too, so like that it becomes accessible for everybody. The reduce component is we try to present the data in like full color, really intuitive graphs where I kind of incept into your brain where this is coming from. And so there's room for improvement there. There's potential for AI, as we move forward. But right now there's that. And then the offset, we actually low-key have like the largest selection of offsets available as far as we can tell anywhere. We can help you find the right offset project for what you're looking for, if that's what you're doing.
When you say offset project, what do you mean by that?
So offsets come from different, so for example, in my Renew West days, we planted 2 million trees in California. that was a project. The offsets that come off of that project get sold and they have the attributes of that project. So I can say, like, this is an offset that I purchased from my tree planting in California. And so, others are associated with women's cook stoves in Nepal, or, the preservation of grasslands in southern Colorado, or whatever. And so those are the kind of the different projects, and they all, there's a marketplace there of different offsets that you can purchase from. So that's kind of the business process. We have 2 tiers of service. For the smallest companies, typically they want to engage in a kind of our self-service. You can almost think of it as like your accounting software, so it just plugs in. It's easy, pretty intuitive. You don't have to spend a lot of time doing it. For the larger companies, sometimes they want a little bit of hand holding, and their operations get a little bit more complex. And so we offer like a bookkeeper service in addition to the software, kind of all for one like integrated price. It's displayed on the website. But the other part, so that's the empower. But getting back to the educate is that we, if you just go to our website, acclimate.com, every day, that's actually the thing that I'm working on for the next 2 weeks, is I'm going to be continuing to create a series of explainer videos about climate. So how can we be a resource for you to just learn about what's going on here? Whether or not you purchase, software offsets from us, like, we would love to be the people that you think of when you got a question. I've done a few TikToks about this, even personally, a little bit of a LinkedIn presence too. So.
And then on the individual level, though, because I know you spoke a little bit about some resources that you can take to your boss, right? And I think that Acclimate has like a little script or something like that you can read and, kind of take to your boss to start that conversation if you don't really know how to start that conversation, right?
Yeah, that's right. So another thing we have on the website, if you go to get started on there, you can type in the name of your company and we can give you a pretty quick estimate of what your footprint is without anything else.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, through public records, we have figured out, what industry you're in, what's your geography, how many employees you work, and we can give you an estimate. It's not precise enough for you to actually do anything with, other than to just kind of like wrap your head around the problem. But it's a place to start, and that's something that you could take to your boss. You can, play around with it all you want. So that's a tool that you can have there. And then, yeah, as you alluded to, we do have a presentation that you can take to your boss as well that talks about like why your company should care. What are some of the changing regulations around it? All the rest of it. Pretty soon we're going to have an ebook up. So if you want to read and learn a little bit more about that, that'll also be on the website. So, and that fits kind of within the education component as well.
This has been such, I think, like an eye-opening conversation for me, just because before, I told you like climate was something that I never really like dove into. And now I feel like, okay, I have a little bit of a beginning, a start to it. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Mike. It was such a pleasure to learn from you, and I'm so excited to talk soon.
Yeah, I enjoyed being here, and I'd love to continue to be a resource.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to learn more about today's topic and guest, head over to the show notes linked in the description of this episode. There, you can get access to resources, links, and ways you can get involved in the pursuit for global health. And if you loved this episode, don't forget to write me a review on Apple Podcasts and rate the podcast on Spotify. It helps me get in front of more people just like you and continues to elevate the causes we are so passionate about. I'll see you in the next one.